To understand why a piece of fabric became a state secret, you have to stand in the conference room at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough in August 1940. The room was filled with Britain's finest aeronautical minds, men with doctorates and knighthoods, staring at a blackboard covered in casualty statistics that told a story of systematic slaughter. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory laid the reality bare. They were losing the visibility war. The Hawker Hurricane, the very spine of Britain's defense, had a 90-degree blind cone directly astern. A German Messerschmitt pilot could position himself in that cone close to within 200 yards and empty his cannons before the British pilot even knew he was being hunted. The tragedy of the Hurricane was that its greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. The pilot sat behind a thick armored headrest, a slab of steel designed to stop bullets from a frontal attack. But that same armor created a massive blind spot, blocking the view 45 degrees to either side of dead astern. To compensate, pilots were physically destroying themselves. They were twisting their necks in the cockpit until vertebrae cracked, craning desperately to spot the enemy clawing for altitude behind them. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, a man who had already been wounded in a dogfight he never saw coming, described the cockpit as a torture chamber. He told the committee that he had seen men pull muscles so badly trying to look behind them that they couldn't turn their heads for a week. Yet the 109s still got through. The proposed solutions from the experts were a catalog of impossibilities. Hawker Aircraft suggested redesigning the entire canopy to a bubble style, similar to what the Spitfire would later have, but the timeline was 18 months. Britain didn't have 18 months. It barely had 18 days. Another team proposed installing rear-view mirrors, a seemingly obvious fix, but wind tunnel tests proved that the mirrors created turbulence that reduced the Hurricane's top speed by 4 miles per hour. At combat altitude, 4 miles per hour was the difference between intercepting a bomber and watching it drop its payload on London. Dr. Frederick Lindenman, Churchill's own scientific advisor, floated the idea of rearward-facing cameras with cockpit displays, but the technology simply didn't exist, and the cost would have been astronomical. The meeting was dominated by the cold pragmatism of Sir Henry Tizard, chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee. His assessment was brutal, but accurate. The Hurricane's design was fixed. They couldn't move the headrest because it was essential armor. They couldn't raise the pilot's seat because the cockpit geometry wouldn't allow it. And they certainly couldn't stop the production lines to retool for a new canopy while they were already struggling to replace the 1,547 aircraft lost in the previous 4 months. The expert consensus was unanimous and devastating. Improving rear visibility required a fundamental airframe redesign that was currently impossible. The official conclusion was that the Hurricane would simply have to fight with its blind spot. The pilots would continue dying at the current rates until the Spitfire, with its superior visibility, could replace the Hurricane as the primary fighter, a transition not scheduled to be complete until mid-1941. This bureaucratic resignation sealed the fate of thousands of young men. By October 1940, the average combat life expectancy of a Hurricane pilot was calculated at just 87 hours of flight time. That was all the time a young man had between his first sortie and his last. The experts had spoken, the math was settled, and the coffin was closed. They just didn't know that a furniture maker in Surrey was about to pry it open. To understand why the solution to the RAF's greatest crisis was ultimately found in a furniture workshop, one must first visit the conference room where the official experts declared the problem unsolvable. It was August 1940, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, Hampshire. The room was populated by the finest aeronautical minds in the British Empire, men who spoke the language of drab coefficients and structural loads. But on this day, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory stood before a blackboard that spoke a simpler, darker language, the mathematics of slaughter. He tapped a diagram of the Hawker Hurricane's cockpit and delivered a verdict that silenced the room. Gentlemen, we're losing the visibility war. The statistics Leigh-Mallory presented were a damning indictment of the Hurricane's design. The data showed that British pilots were suffering from a 90-degree blind cone directly astern. This wasn't a minor obstruction, it was a fatal tunnel of invisibility.
A German Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilot could position himself inside this cone, close to within 200 yards, and open fire with cannon shells before the British pilot even registered a threat. The cruelty of the engineering was that the very device meant to save the pilot was the thing getting him killed. The Hurricane featured a heavy, armored headrest designed to stop bullets from frontal attacks, but this slab of steel blocked rearward vision entirely. The human cost of this blind spot was articulated by squadron leader Peter Townsend, who offered the pilot's perspective to the committee. Townsend described a cockpit environment that was physically destroying his men before the enemy even fired a shot. "We're breaking our necks trying to look behind us," he told the engineers. He reported seeing pilots pull neck muscles so severely that they couldn't turn their heads for a week, yet they continued to do it because the alternative was death. The pilots knew the Hurricane could outturn a 109, but as the grim adage went, you can't dodge what you can't see.
The meeting was intended to generate solutions, and the memoranda filled 3 pages, but each proposal collided with the hard wall of physics or logistics. Hawker Aircraft suggested a complete redesign of the canopy to a bubble style, similar to what would later appear on the P-51 Mustang. The engineers crunched the numbers and returned with a timeline: 18 months minimum. Britain was losing the war that week. 18 months might as well have been a century. Another team proposed the installation of rear-view mirrors. It seemed the most obvious, common-sense fix. However, wind tunnel tests revealed a depressing reality. The mirrors created turbulence that reduced the Hurricane's top speed by 4 miles per hour. In the high-altitude chase of 1940, 4 miles per hour was the difference between catching a Heinkel bomber and watching it escape to bomb London. Desperation even drove the brilliant Dr. Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's scientific advisor, to propose rearward-facing cameras linked to cockpit displays. It was a visionary idea that predicted modern avionics, but in 1940 the technology was non-existent, the development timeline was unknown, and the cost would have been astronomical. The final nail in the coffin was hammered in by Sir Henry Tizard, the chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee. His logic was cold, unassailable, and terrifying. "The Hurricane's design is fixed," he declared. "They could not move the armored headrest without sacrificing pilot protection. They could not raise the seat because the cockpit geometry wouldn't allow it. And they certainly could not pause production lines to retool the fuselage while the RAF was struggling to replace combat losses." The expert consensus was unanimous. Improving rear visibility required a fundamental airframe redesign that was impossible under wartime conditions. The official conclusion was that the Hurricane would simply have to fight with its blind spot. The pilots would continue dying at the current rates until the Spitfire, with its superior visibility, could replace the Hurricane as the primary fighter, a transition scheduled for mid-1941. This decision effectively signed the death warrants of hundreds of men. By October 1940, the average combat life expectancy of a Hurricane pilot had plummeted to just 87 hours of flight time. That was 4 weeks. That was all the time a young man had between his first sortie and his inevitable end, trapped in a coffin built by experts who said there was no other way. While the Air Ministry's best minds were paralyzed by the impossibility of redesigning the Hurricane, the solution was taking shape 30 miles away in a factory canteen at Brooklyn, Surrey. Frederick George Miles was not the man anyone expected to revolutionize fighter combat. At 34, he was a self-taught engineer who had left school at 16 to work in his father's furniture workshop. He possessed no university degree, no formal aeronautics training, and absolutely no business designing modifications for His Majesty's frontline fighters. What he did have, however, was a small company building training planes and an obsessive habit of spending his lunch breaks listening to the men who actually flew the missions. It was during one of these canteen lunches that Miles sat across from a Hurricane pilot named James Nicholson. Nicholson, who would later receive the Victoria Cross, was describing a recent near-death experience with unusual precision.
He explained that he knew the German fighter was behind him before the bullets started flying. He could feel it, a primal sense of being watched. But he couldn't confirm it without breaking formation and turning his head, a maneuver that bled crucial speed. By the time he turned to look, the enemy had already opened fire. Miles leaned forward and asked the question that would change the war. What if you could see him without turning your head? When Nicholson dismissed mirrors as useless, Miles muttered, "Not mirrors. What if the air itself could tell you?" That evening, Miles stayed late in his workshop, surrounded by fabric samples, his mind drifting back to a windstorm he had observed the previous winter. He recalled how fabric stretched across a frame had vibrated and rippled in the turbulent air, creating visible patterns that revealed invisible wind currents. He realized that aircraft move through the sky exactly like ships move through water. They leave wakes of disturbed air trailing behind them. Physics dictated that a pursuing fighter, in order to get into a firing position, had to fly directly through that disturbed air. Miles realized that if he could make that invisible turbulence visible, the pilot wouldn't need to turn his head to know he was in danger. The prototype was absurdly simple, constructed with materials found in any furniture shop or hangar. Miles took a roll of lightweight cotton, the same material used for covering aircraft control surfaces, and cut a strip 18 inches long and 3 inches wide. At his workbench, he bent a piece of piano wire, the high-tensile steel used for control cables, into a simple frame and mounted the fabric strip to it with quick-release fasteners. The concept relied on placing these strips on the Hurricane's upper wing surface, just aft of the cockpit, sitting squarely in the pilot's peripheral vision. Miles theorized that when a pursuing aircraft entered the Hurricane's wake, the dirty air would cause the fabric strips to flutter in distinctive patterns. The pilot would see the motion out of the corner of his eye and know instantly, instinctively, that an enemy was closing from behind. He sketched the mounting configuration, angling the strip slightly upward to catch the maximum airflow. The total weight of the device was 4 ounces. The total cost for materials and labor was 11 shillings. Looking at his crude invention, Miles admitted to himself that it looked like something a child might make for a school project. He knew the Air Ministry would laugh him out of the building, but with pilots dying every hour, he decided to test it anyway. September 3rd, 1940, 6:15 a.m. The sun had not yet burned off the mist at Brooklyn's aerodrome when Frederick Miles arrived, carrying a canvas bag that contained the potential salvation of the RAF. Parked on the tarmac was a Hurricane Mk1, grounded for routine maintenance and officially unavailable for flight testing. To touch a service aircraft without authorization was a court-martial offense. To modify one with untested equipment was nearly treasonous. Miles didn't care. He'd convinced the maintenance crew chief, a man named Albert Simmons, to look the other way for 20 minutes. "This is completely irregular, Mr. Miles," Simmons muttered as he positioned a ladder against the fighter's wing. "If the group captain finds out I let you modify a service aircraft without authorization," Miles cut him off from atop the wing, "then we won't tell him." The installation was laughably fast. The fabric strips were attached using spring clips Miles had designed to grip the wing's leading edge without damaging the aluminum skin. It took 12 minutes. When Miles stepped back, the strips fluttered gently in the morning breeze, stark white and ridiculous against the Hurricane's war-weary camouflage paint. The silence was broken by the arrival of Chief Test Pilot George Bowman, coffee in hand. He stopped dead in his tracks. "What in God's name is that?" he asked. When Miles explained it was a visibility enhancement system, Bowman scoffed. "It looks like you've decorated a fighter with ladies' handkerchiefs. Will you fly it?" The ensuing argument captured the tension of the war effort, the clash between peacetime procedure and wartime desperation. Bowman circled the aircraft, listing the violations. The Air Ministry hadn't approved it, there was no wind tunnel data, there was no safety review. For all we know, those strips could tear off at high speed and damage the tail surfaces, Bowman warned.
Miles countered with the only number that mattered. 87 hours, George. That's the average combat life expectancy right now. 87 hours. He argued that while they followed safety protocols, men were burning to death in cockpits. The logic hung heavy in the damp morning air. Bowman stared at the fabric strips, then at Miles. "If something goes wrong up there, it's my license," he said. Miles nodded. "And if this works, you're taking full credit." Bowman shook his head. "I'm not having my name attached to something that looks this bloody ridiculous." But he climbed into the cockpit. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared to life. Miles watched from the flight line as the Hurricane accelerated, the fabric strips fluttering violently in the slipstream. For 20 minutes, Bowman brutalized the aircraft, steep climbs, high-speed dives, and sharp banking turns, testing whether the clips would hold. When he landed and taxied back, his face was unreadable. "Well?" Miles asked. "They work," Bowman said quietly. He revealed that he had ordered Simmons to chase him in a Miles Master trainer. Every time he closed to within 400 yards, the strips went mad. Different patterns depending on his position. I could tell where he was without looking. The experiment was a success, but the victory was short-lived. "So we show this to the Air Ministry?" Miles asked. Bowman laughed bitterly. "You show this to the Air Ministry, they'll have you committed." He explained that the senior engineers would view it as amateurish and dangerous, violating every principle of clean aerodynamic design. They would never approve it through official channels. "Then what do we do?" Miles asked. "We bypass them. We go straight to someone who cares more about dead pilots than proper procedure." They were going to Bentley Priory. Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, September 10, 1940. It was 2:30 p.m., and the conference room was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. Air Vice Admiral Lee Mallory had assembled the very same experts who, just 3 weeks earlier, had declared the Hurricane's visibility problem unsolvable. Now these men, knights of the realm, doctors of engineering, and captains of industry, were being told that the solution they missed had been found by a furniture maker's son using fabric scraps. Frederick Miles stood at the front of the room, his crude prototype mounted on a demonstration board. The atmosphere was not of curiosity, but of hostility. Joseph Smith, the man who succeeded Reginald Mitchell at Supermarine, looked at the device with barely concealed contempt. "This is your solution? Fabric tape?" Miles corrected him firmly, explaining that the strips detected airflow disturbances to provide visual warnings.
But the establishment was not ready to listen. Dr. William Foran from the Royal Aircraft Establishment immediately declared the concept aerodynamically impossible. He argued that the Hurricane's own slipstream would cause constant flutter, meaning the pilot would be seeing false warnings continuously. In his professional opinion, the device would be worse than useless and actively distracting in combat. Miles didn't argue physics, he argued data. He distributed the flight report from George Bowman, the highly respected test pilot. "Test data shows otherwise," Miles replied. He read the numbers aloud. In 17 simulated attack approaches, the strips provided accurate warnings in exactly 17 cases. There were 0 false positives. The room erupted. Instead of applause, there was outrage. "Unauthorized testing on a service aircraft," someone shouted. They demanded wind tunnel data and structural loading charts. Sir Henry Tizard, the most powerful scientist in the British military establishment, stood up to restore order. His voice was cold and dismissive. "Mr. Miles, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we cannot modify frontline fighters based on one unauthorized test flight," Tizard said. He listed the potential catastrophes. The strips could tear off, they could affect handling, or they could create dangerous turbulence. Miles had heard enough. He interrupted the chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee. "How many pilots died while you were discussing testing protocols?" The room went dead silent. Miles pressed his advantage. "Yesterday, we lost 14 Hurricanes. Last week, 41. He reminded them that the Luftwaffe was slaughtering their boys simply because they couldn't see. "I'm offering a solution that costs 11 shillings per aircraft. How many more men have to die before we try something different?" Tizard began to shut him down, declaring the meeting over. Then a voice came from the back of the room. "Show me." Every head turned. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had entered quietly. At 58, Stucky Dowding bore the personal responsibility for every pilot's death on his face that looked like carved from stone. He walked forward. Tizard protested immediately. "Sir, this device hasn't been properly evaluated." Dowding cut him off with a history lesson.
Neither had radar when I approved its installation, he said. Neither had the Spitfires' 8-gun armament. He reminded the room that they had won battles with impossible innovations before. He turned to Miles. "You'll demonstrate your strips tomorrow at Northolt. I'll observe personally." The ultimatum was simple. If they worked, Dowding would authorize immediate field testing. If they failed, Miles was to remove them and never waste his time again.
As the meeting adjourned, Dowding addressed the room of shocked experts one last time. "Gentlemen, we're losing this battle," he said. "If fabric strips can change that, I don't care if they look ridiculous or violate aerodynamic principles. I care whether they save lives." The paperwork had lost. The test was on. On the morning of September 11th, 1940, the mist cleared at RAF Northolt to reveal a scene that would determine the fate of hundreds of young men. 3 Hurricanes sat on the flight line, 1 modified with Frederick Miles fabric strips, and 2 standard-issue fighters. Standing on the tarmac with his arms crossed was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the architect of Britain's air defense, a man whose face was carved from stone and haunted by casualty lists. Beside him stood the man chosen to prove the concept, Squadron Leader Douglas Bader. Bader was already a legend, a pilot flying with 2 prosthetic legs, renowned for his aggression, but looking at the cotton strips taped to the wings of the test aircraft, he was skeptical. He asked Miles if he seriously expected him to fly with handkerchiefs on his wings. Miles, standing nearby, gave a simple answer that cut through the bravado. "I want you to survive." The test protocol was brutal in its simplicity. Bader would fly the modified Hurricane first, while 2 other fighters attempted to sneak into his blind spot, that lethal 90-degree cone directly astern, and close to firing range without being detected. Bader was ordered to maintain radio silence and rely entirely on visual detection. He climbed to 15,000 feet and began a standard combat air patrol pattern. Below him, Dowding watched through binoculars as the 2 chase aircraft began their stalk, maneuvering into the kill zone. Up in the cockpit, the experience was entirely new for Bader. In a standard flight, a pilot's eyes are constantly scanning, dashing from instruments to the horizon, checking 6, straining the neck, but here, the fabric strips sat in his peripheral vision. In smooth air, they were calm, fluttering gently like leaves in a breeze. Then the physics of the 6th sense kicked in. An aircraft pushing through the atmosphere creates a pressure wave, a bow wave similar to a ship moving through water. Before the enemy fighter is close enough to be seen clearly against the dark earth or blinding sun, this invisible wave of disturbed air travels ahead of it. Suddenly, the left strip on Bader's wing began to ripple. It wasn't a violent flap, but a distinctive wave pattern moving from front to back. Bader didn't look behind him, he didn't second guess, he trusted the physics. He broke hard left, pulling 4 Gs. A split second later, a chase Hurricane flashed through the empty space Bader had occupied just a moment before. "Contact," Bader radioed. "Left quarter, 400 yards. The chase pilots reset and tried again. This time, the right strip rippled. Bader broke right, catching his pursuer trying to climb for altitude. Finally, both strips fluttered simultaneously. Bader knew instantly what it meant, a threat directly astern. He executed a barrel roll, bringing him nose-to-nose with the startled chase pilot. On the ground, Dowding's expression remained stony, but his chief of staff noticed his knuckles turning white as he gripped his binoculars. The second phase of the test proved the point in reverse. Bader switched to an unmodified Hurricane, and the difference was stark. Observers saw Bader twisting in his seat, craning his neck, physically fighting the cockpit's geometry. He caught one attacker by pure chance, but missed the second entirely until it broke off its attack run. "2 contacts," he radioed, breathlessly, "but I had to work bloody hard for them."
When Bader landed, he didn't offer congratulations. He walked straight to Miles and demanded, "How soon can you put these on every Hurricane in Fighter Command?" The formal testing that followed over the next 10 days provided the hard data to back up Bader's instincts.
12 operational pilots flew 57 simulated combat missions, and the results were statistically overwhelming. Without the strips, pilots detected pursuing aircraft only 31% of the time before they reached simulated firing range. The average detection distance was just 380 yards, dangerously close. With the strips, detection rates skyrocketed to 89%. The average detection distance pushed out to 520 yards. To a layman, the difference between 380 yards and 520 yards, a mere 140 yards, might seem negligible. But in the mathematics of 1940 aerial combat, those 140 yards represented something priceless: time. At the closing speeds of a Messerschmitt diving on a hurricane, 140 yards bought the pilot slightly less than 2 seconds. 2 seconds was the difference between a pilot reacting instinctively and a pilot dying unaware. It was the time needed to kick the rudder, bank the wings, and turn a sitting duck into a difficult target. On September 25th, Dowding authorized immediate production. By early October, the technology met its final test: actual combat. Pilot Officer Eric Locke, a 20-year-old with only 17 hours of combat time, found himself targeted by a Bf-109 while lining up a bomber kill. He never saw the German fighter dropping from 6 o'clock high, but the strips did. They rippled violently in his peripheral vision, and Locke didn't think, he reacted. He broke hard right, pulling so many Gs that gray edges crept into his vision. Cannon shells tore through the air where his cockpit had been a second earlier. Locke reversed his turn, shot down his attacker, and then used the strips to detect and destroy a second 109 minutes later. In his debriefing, Locke's report was simple: "I saw him coming. Not with my eyes, with those bloody strips. They gave me 2 seconds warning. That's all I needed." Those 2 seconds were the margin between life and death, gifted by a piece of fluttering cotton. The combat reports that flooded into fighter command throughout October and November 1940 told a story that defied the expectations of every expert in the Air Ministry. Squadron after squadron reported this same phenomenon. Pilots were surviving encounters that, statistically, should have killed them. The numbers painted a stark picture of before and after. In September 1940, before the strips were widely installed, the hurricane loss rate to fighter attacks stood at 73 aircraft per 1,000 sorties. By November, with the strips in place, that number plummeted to 44 per 1,000. That is a 40% reduction in losses. In the cold language of military logistics, it meant millions of pounds saved in airframes. But in human terms, the deficit was far more profound. That 40% represented fewer telegrams delivered to trembling hands in British doorways. It meant 40% more husbands and sons coming home for Christmas. The sudden shift in survivability confused the Germans. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from the period described a mysterious new technology on RAF fighters. Oberlieutenant Franz von Wehre, a German ace shot down and captured in September, revealed the extent of their paranoia during interrogation. He admitted that German pilots believed the British had developed miniature rear-facing radar because the Hurricanes were evading attacks before a shot was fired.
When von Wehre finally saw a captured Hurricane on the ground, he was stunned. He saw simple fabric strips, which he described as looking like children's toys, yet he conceded that they worked, noting that the Hurricane pilots were no longer blind. By December 1940, the Air Ministry, the same body that had called the idea absurd, standardized the invention. Officially designated as Airflow Warning Devices Type M, the strips became standard equipment on 47 Hurricane squadrons. Yet if you look for Frederick Miles in the popular histories of the Battle of Britain, you will struggle to find him. This is not an accident. It was a choice. When the Air Ministry offered him the Order of the British Empire, OBE, and financial compensation, he refused both. He told the officers, "I made fabric strips. Pilots saved lives. Give those honors to the pilots." Miles refused to write his memoirs or give interviews, insisting that the strips only worked because pilots had the courage to trust their instincts. He allowed history to forget him, satisfied that the men he saved would remember. On May 8, 1945, while the rest of Britain celebrated victory in Europe, Frederick Miles stood in his workshop, uncomfortable with the sudden influx of champagne and gratitude. It was there that the past returned to thank him in the form of James Nicholson, the Hurricane pilot whose casual comment and a canteen had started it all. Nicholson gripped Miles' hand and told him,
Because of you, I came home. Because of you, I'll have children who will never know how close they came to not existing. When the Air Ministry arrived shortly after to offer Miles the Order of the British Empire and financial compensation for saving the Crown millions in aircraft costs, Miles quietly interrupted them. He refused the money and the medal, telling the officers, "I made fabric strips. Pilots saved lives. Give those honors to the pilots." Miles spent the rest of his life deflecting credit, eventually asking for his name to be removed from official histories. When he died in 1976 at the age of 70, his obituary in the Times granted his wartime contribution only a single sentence, and no one from the Air Ministry attended his funeral. However, the men who mattered, the men who had flown through the fire, did not forget. In 2003, a group of Battle of Britain veterans, now in their 80s, commissioned a simple plaque at Brooklands. It does not list his patents or his profits. It reads simply, "Frederick George Miles, engineer. His fabric strips gave us seconds. Those seconds gave us our lives." It remains a permanent testament to the fact that sometimes the difference between life and death isn't a government committee or a £1,000,000 budget, but a humble man with 11 shillings worth of tape and the courage to ignore the experts.